welcome to Sundays with Brother Barry Scott. Now, I know we've been out of pocket here for a few weeks. I'm hoping to get back on a regular schedule. Some of that, I'm actually breaking in a new camera person, and it's going to involve sending off my little, I guess you'd call it, disc. That's going to go to my good friend Steve Beverly down in Florida. He's going to continue to edit and hope that will work. But anyway, I'm glad to be back here at the Scott Wesleyan Cathedral. Now you may note, if you've seen a lot of these, I'm wearing glasses. The reason for that, it's actually in the evening, and I didn't wear my contacts today, and I decided I wasn't going to put them on just to preach. I don't really like preaching with my glasses on, but I decided to go ahead. Looking at a very well-known parable found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12. I'm going to read verses 13 through 21. My sermon title, The Fool Who Couldn't Get Enough, and it's also known as the parable of the rich fool. Luke chapter 12, starting with verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God." There's a silly old story about a man who was visited by an angel, and he was told by the angel that he would be granted one wish. The man thought what would be a good wish, and so he came up with this. He said, "I'd like to have a newspaper dated 1 year in the future." He figured that he could look and see how to get rich by buying the right kind of stocks and investments. And sure enough, he was given that newspaper. He looked at it a year in the future and realized, and he shouted out, "Hooray! I'm going to be worth at least $15 million. Just so happened, though, that the newspaper flipped over and there was the obituary page. The man suddenly gasped and said, "Oh no, I died 2 days ago and I'm being buried today." Now, the farmer in this parable needed a paper just like that. The key word here is enough, because this is a story about a fool who couldn't get enough. His problem was with enough. What, when, and in what way is enough? Reminds me of a favorite story of James Dobson. He talks about playing a game of Monopoly with his family one day. Everything was going his way. Every roll of the dice, he was landing on the best properties. He soon had Parkway, Boardwalk. He was dominating the boards, putting up hotels, and he got a little too enthusiastic about what was happening to him. Kind of began to rub the rest of his family the wrong way. He was really kind of gloating over how he was accumulating everything, investing everybody else, and he really realized he had went overboard at the end of the game when he had won. His wife Shirley said, "Well, you put everything away." And James Dotson was left alone there at the kitchen table. He started to put up all the hotels and the cards that showed the property he had accumulated, and it suddenly hit him that life is a whole lot like the game of Monopoly. The game of life, the game of Monopoly are very similar. You can try and get it all, but life, like the game, ends and everything has to be returned to the box. You can't take anything with you. No U-Haul follows the hearse. We come into this world with a clenched fist and we die with an open hand. Each person has to answer the question that was asked of the rich fool in verse 20. This very night your life will be demanded from you, God said. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? Here's a man who had more than enough, too much of enough, enough of the wrong things and not nearly enough of what really counts in life. This is a parable about a big fool and his small barns. That's the point. For you see, barns aren't nearly big enough to house a soul ever. Jesus called the man a fool. Now that's a word with a cutting edge. We don't particularly get disturbed if we're referred to as sinners. We all know we're sinners. But no one wants to be called a fool or regarded or look foolish. I think of the great preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon. He once got an anonymous letter, and when he opened it up, it just had one word sprawled across of it, the word fool. Obviously, that's what someone thought of him. But Spurgeon turned the tables, because the next Sunday he took that letter into the pulpit and held it up with that big word fool on it, and he said, "I tell you what, this is the first time someone remembered to sign their name, but they forgot to write the letter." The Bible uses the term fool not in reference to a person's intelligence. It doesn't really have anything to do about that, but it's used referring to a lack of relationship with God. Saying there is no God or acting as if there is no God, that God doesn't matter, puts a person in the category of a fool. You're not a fool because you've done something foolish, but only if the folly of it escapes you. Imagine how it feels to stand before your God and hear his summation echo that is given this man in the parable. And now, just exactly why did Jesus call the farmer foolish? Who is a fool in God's sight? You see, a fool distorts the understanding of enough. The problem was not with this man's wealth or his actions or his morals. He may have had great morals. That, in fact, there's a whole lot for which this man could be praised. By our standards, he would be regarded as very successful. And yet Jesus labeled him a failure, and it was the worst failure of all because he flunked life and he's branded a fool. Why? He was a fool because he lived as if God didn't matter. You see, just make your goal be getting enough. Are we living as if God doesn't matter? Then we're as foolish as this man in the story. We're not accountable. Now that's foolish, Jesus says. The fool never mentions or acknowledges God. He's replaced the need of God for the need of things. Success is a wonderful thing, but knowing the God of the successful is even better. He was a fool because he didn't have enough sense to look up or even look around past his own self-interest. There's a legend of a swan and a crane. The crane was wading in a creek, searching for his favorite food, which were snails. Suddenly he looked up, and there was a beautiful heavenly bird, a beautiful swan. "Where did you come from?" the old crane asked the swan. "Why, heaven," said the swan. "What is heaven like?" And the swan described to him the wonders and beauty of that place. But after the swan had talked about heaven, the crane said, "Are there any snails there?" "Well, of course not," said the beautiful swan. "There are no snails in heaven." The crane said, "Then you can have your heaven. I want snails." That's the way a lot of people are. In this man's pursuit of enough, he was self-centered. It's a parable full of personal pronouns. He lives completely for himself. He talks to himself. He plans for himself. He congratulates himself. He had missed life's true purpose, thinking that life's purpose was to accumulate as much as you possibly can, rather than applying his talents and resources as a service to others for God's glory. It was all about what he wanted out of life, rather than enriching his life by turning to God to find meaning and fulfillment. He was all about eating, drinking, and being merry. The resources God had blessed him with were there simply to be consumed according to his own appetites and fancies. In his mid-20s, a young man was diagnosed with a serious cancer. They removed a growth from his groin. He underwent chemotherapy, but that failed. The cancer spread to a lot of his organs. And yet, when he was discussing his situation with one of his professors, he said, "Well, it could be worse." There he was in his early 20s, only a few weeks to live, and yet he said it could be worse. The professor wanted to know, well, how in the world could it be worse? The young man said, "Well, I could be in my 50s and have no faith or value in God. I could still think that life consisted just of seducing women, drinking booze, popping pills, and making money. Life's greatest tragedies of the spirit. We curse the lesser tragedies and want them removed, little realizing that if they were, others would rise in their place because we haven't solved the reason they exist, our misunderstanding of God and His Son, Jesus Christ. The real tragedy is to live life with no real understanding of what life is about, just like this fool. How did this rich farmer get to be such a fool? It was the process and the pursuit of accumulating enough. The simplest explanation is this farmer was possessed by his possessions. His outward sin was greed, but the hidden sin was covetousness, wrapped up in selfishness. You see, not wanting something is often better than possessing it. Always wanting more is an unfillable hole. You see, if greed is your sin, then the amount is never really that important. How much does it take to satisfy? I think of what a very wealthy man who was asked that question, and his answer was this: always just a little more than what you have now. If the goal is enough, then enough is never enough. There's nothing wrong with possessions till they possess us. The fool had big, wonderful barns, but I want to tell you, you and I have our own version of that. Fancy cars, computers, cell phones, beautiful homes crammed full of wonderful stuff and gadgets. Nothing wrong with all that stuff, especially if we thank God. It's only wrong when, like the fool, our perspective of life becomes distorted. You see, it wasn't just one thing, not this particular season of abundance that the man enjoyed. That wasn't what caused the farmer's downfall. The bumper crop was only the climax of his life's patterns. He was all about enough, bigger barns, and by barn, he isolated himself from God, from others, from real meaning and purpose. Understand this, the devil is very wily. He never tries, or most of the time he never tries to get a person to sell out in one dramatic move. He's content to have people barter away their souls barn by barn. There was a nightingale, a bird, who was digging for worms, but one day he happened to meet a worm salesman. He said, "You mean you sell worms?" "Yes." "Well, what does it cost to get a worm?" said the nightingale. The man said, "It would cost you one feather." And the nightingale gladly gave him a feather. The worm salesman gave him a great big worm. It was delicious. The next day, the nightingale was back with another feather, and so on, and so on, and so on, until one day he realized that his feathers were all gone. And then he went to the worm salesman with a worm, and he said, "I'd like to trade my worm back for a feather." The salesman shook his head and he said, "No, you don't understand. You see, my business is not trading feathers for worms, but only worms for feathers." You see, that's the fool's trap that he fell into. Things misused can narrow our world. Here's a lesson that needs to be learned. We are fools to the extent that our possessions possess us. The farmer was foolish because his definition of enough was not nearly enough. He left out some key elements. He forgot to include God, but he also forgot the perspective of stewardship. He takes all the credit, but Jesus points out the land produced the good crop, not the landowner. Taking too much credit is the mindset from which greed springs. It distorts our dependence on God. The farmer did exactly what God warned the nation of Israel against when they came into the promised land. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 12 through 14. "Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." You see, there's a strange twist to Thanksgiving. Getting more than enough can make people less thankful, less willing to acknowledge their dependence on God, more proud, more self-sufficient, more self-satisfied. One of the best arguments for stewardship, for faithful giving, is it'll keep you from playing the fool. It moves from "I don't have enough" to having enough to give, and that's where the real joy and blessings of life come. In this man's pursuit of securing enough in the immediate, he forgot all about the eternal. He forgot neither his barns or his life was forever. He thought time was working in his favor to secure enough, but it was actually working against him. It always is. He assumed he had many more years, but God declared, "You're leaving tonight and you're taking nothing with you." I like this little writing here. He brushed his teeth twice a day with a nationally advertised toothpaste. The doctors examined him twice a year. He wore his rubbers when it rained. He slept with the windows open to get fresh air. He stuck to a diet with plenty of fresh fruits and vegetables. He gave up his tonsils and traded in several worn-out glands. He golfed, but never more than 18 holes at a time. Didn't want to overdo it. Moderation in all things, you know. He got at least 8 hours of sleep every night. He never smoked, drank, or lost his temper. He did his daily meaning his exercises. He was all set to live to be 100 years old. His funeral will be held Wednesday. He has survived an 18th specialist, 4 health institutes, 6 gyms, and numerous manufacturers of health, foods, and antiseptics. He just made one mistake. He forgot God in all of that. The rich fool lived his life in light of the future, but that future didn't include the kingdom of God, death, or the judgment to come. The rich man's future was only as long as his earthly life and only as broad as his own interest. His view of the future was not nearly big enough. He forgot the real meaning of life is not found in what you accumulate, but how you spend your life. I like this thing, 10 things that God's not going to ask you. God won't ask you what kind of car you drove, but He'll ask how many people you drove who didn't have transportation. God won't ask the square footage of your house. He'll ask how many people you welcomed into your house. God won't ask about your social status, but will ask what kind of class you displayed. God won't ask how many material possessions you had, but will ask if they dictated your life. God won't ask what your highest salary was, but will ask if you compromised your character to obtain the salary. God won't ask how much overtime you worked, but will ask if you worked overtime for your family and loved ones. God won't ask what you did to help yourself, but will ask what you did to help others. God won't ask how many friends you had, but will ask how many people to whom you were a true friend. God won't ask what you did to protect your rights, but will ask you what you did to protect the rights of others. God won't ask in what neighborhood you lived, but will ask you how you treated your neighbors. Finally, the farmer died a fool because he didn't have enough, not nearly enough of what really counts for time and eternity. He was foolish because he never realized how poor he was, how little he had, or how much he had lost. You see, he died a spiritual pauper. That's why Jesus said earlier, before he told this parable in verse 15 of Luke 12, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. How valuable is a soul compared to barns? How short of enough is that? A pastor was invited to dinner in the home of a very wealthy man in Texas. After the meal, the host led him to a place where they could get a good view of the surrounding area, his property, pointing to an oil wells he posted, 25 years ago I had nothing. Now as far as you can see in all directions, it's all mine. He looked and showed in one direction there were crops galore, that's all mine. Then he had the preacher turn and look at a huge herd of cattle. He said, that's mine. Any direction, and it was all his. He expected the pastor to compliment him, but the pastor placed one hand on the man's shoulder and he pointed heavenward and he said, how much do you have in that direction? The man hung his head and confessed, I never thought of that. If you lost everything in the way of worldly possessions, would you still have enough to make your life worth living? You will if you are rich towards God. Verse 21, this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. Let me tell you something. From someone's viewpoint, everyone's going to be considered a fool. But what kind of fool will you be? The great missionary David Livingstone was going through some rough times. The funds weren't coming in to operate his mission. He was physically exhausted. He hadn't been feeling good. Plus he was getting reports back from his home country in England of others that he had been in school with, and they had advanced in their careers, and there he was struggling in the interior of Africa, and he was so discouraged, so disheartened, he just put his hands in his head and he exclaimed out loud, "I'm a fool, what a fool I am." There was a old native who had been converted to Christianity many years before and had worked with Livingstone. He heard what Livingstone said, and he went up to the great missionary and he said, "Yes, boss, down here a big fool, but not up there." There are going to be two possibilities when we stand before God. We're either going to hear him say, "Well done, good and faithful servant," or, "You fool." So, take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. Pictures of those big barns flashing in his mind, his goal of enough now in vision. But God said, "Poor fool, you've lost your life and you've lost your soul. Enough. You have nothing." The fool filled his barns with stuff that's never enough. Don't let that be the summary of your life. How do you define the meaning of enough? Your definition is all important, so make sure it's the right one, the right definition. Don't be an eternal fool who valued little barns. Do you have enough? Enough of God? Enough to bless others? Does God have enough of you? And may God add his blessings to his word.